Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be explaining the article, The Colonial Pastoral, Abolition, and the Transcendentalist Sublime. It's an article by Paul Autka. It was published in 2008 and it's divided into three different sections: Colonial Whiteness and the Neo-Edenic Pastoral, Transcendentalism, the White Sublime and the Traumatic Pastoral, and Territory and the Fugitive Slave Law. So in the first section, Colonial Whiteness and the Neo-Edenic Pastoral, Autka begins by deconstructing the myth of the kind of paradise that colonial European settlers would have experienced when they came to America. So instead of viewing kind of like the forests of America as this beautiful paradise, this like untouched natural space, they viewed it as an unredeemed, unchristian, hostile space, because to their mind, in the Christian mythos of Eden was a cultivated space. So it was a pastoral space, which is to say that like everything was cultivated fields, everything was very like there was no predation, so there was no like predator-prey relationships, and that cultural weight kind of carried to their attitudes towards the American landscape, so it became something that they had to tame, and they saw themselves as Adam taming America back into this like neo-Edenic state, which is to say like a new Eden. And he speaks about how this is apparent in Thomas Cole's Expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is a painting from 1828, a little further into the future, but it's really like an important visual to him because it has these two figures in the center of Adam and Eve, and they're fleeing God's wrath across a natural bridge, which is like a common symbol of the American Sublime. And then the left side has like wilderness, it has the predator-prey relationships, it has volcanoes, it has old growth forests, and the right side has like a super tame anthropocentric garden with like the different animals coexisting, no need for predation, no need to cultivate, like everything's pre-cultivated. And while it's supposed to be meant to be read from like right to left in order to like be the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, most paintings are read from left to right, so it's kind of invoking this idea of like a return to paradise. And for like colonial settlers, the wilderness wasn't a romantic place, it was a place of exile, it was a place of punishment, so its value was only in being converted into something else. There was no inherent value in like the forest and landscape, just in its act of transformation. So it was a sense of like white hostility towards the landscape, and it justified like the clear cutting of the Atlantic forests and everything like that. But it's not just, Auka's really clear about the idea that it's not just like an incorrect way of looking at nature, it's more that the way that nature is constructed, it's constructed around human biases and the ideological purposes and their like motivations towards the natural landscape. Nature construction is considered self-construction to him. So, and the ideas about race were also built into ideas about nature, which is like really apparent when you think about the idea that like the wilderness at the time was inhabited by like millions of native people resisting the colonial expansion. So in the 18th and 19th century, white Europeans viewed race as at least partially like the an effect of climate and environment. So it's not just evolution, it's not just the will of God, it's the way that the people are raised. The climate is making somebody more lazy or less lazy, or more hardworking or less hardworking, and nature is presumed to belong to like mankind in general. So it's the will of the earth when, you know, an indigenous person or an indigenous race is more predisposed to European diseases or something like that, it's blamed on kind of like the will of like the creator. So it's another example of kind of nature taking on human biases, or nature in human discourse being kind of put forth as the reasoning for human biases. And so the act of aligning whiteness with the pastoral like required constant racial violence, and the environment became a source of pride So a pastoral mirror of like white civilization, but also of anxiety, because it was this tempting wilderness that like threatened white civilized society. So wilderness could degenerate the white subject into a savage hunter who identifies with the wilderness. And over time, the idea of the white and the pastoral came to signify each other. In the second part, Transcendentalism, the White Sublime, and the Traumatic Pastoral, Auca is focused on the shift in the white view towards nature. So for him, this centers around the abolitionist movement. And at the time, nature, there was an important shift in the racialization of nature. So the rise of Transcendentalism occurred at the same time as the public voice of African Americans emerging in the abolition movement. There was a lot of slave narratives coming out, and there was a new push towards the publishing of African American literature around the experience of slavery. Nature was being represented as the degraded site of slavery and environmental destruction, and then at the same time, in the white perspective, it was being viewed as a symbol of individualism and absolute freedom. And that division continues to be at the heart of the American relationship to nature. There's an avoidance of race that's important to the white American love of nature. So the epicenter of that shift was centered around southern plantations and New England landscapes, as the man versus nature struggle that characterized a lot of earlier colonization moved west. Southern plantations and New England landscapes came to be the site of this like radical new attitude towards nature. So there was no love of, and there was no kind of romanticizing of the idea of wilderness until that wilderness had been tamed. So once they had accomplished the colonial eco-ideology of colonization and created these pastoral landscapes, then the idea of a free nature began to be romanticized. And so the new wilds, which is to say the new ideas towards wildness, were seen as the origin of the non-wild. So there's kind of a circular perspective there, this circular understanding of like the construction of the mythos of Eden after having created a new Eden. And there is, it is marked by this kind of temporal and spatial latency, both for the romantic and the Eden myth. So there's this want to return to a mythical origin story. There's a nostalgia of the self or of a socially constructed past, but that was a past that is created and recreated. So where the past used to be considered this neo-Edenic pastoral vision, now it's of this return to the Edenic wild. There is a wanting for what they don't have, an idea of wilderness as a place to retreat to, and it's the assertion of union, of wanting to be connected to nature from a position of separation. So once you're separate from nature, once you exist in a cultivated space, then there's that longing to return, that wanting to be a part of the natural and of the wild. And so sublimity captures the separation from the desired landscape, and also being in alliance with it. So it's a position between a state of loss and a state of fulfillment. The sublime subject makes nature signify their new empowered subjectivity in an implied sign of whiteness. So Weiskel is really important to this process. He's got to structure a three-step economic process where the first phase is before the sublime relationship. The sublime, the relationship between the self and the world is peaceful, and then in the second phase, the habitual relationship of the mind and the object in this case being nature, it breaks down. So one of the two is in excess, and then because there is a state of excess, then both are in excess. And then in the third phase, the mind recovers the balance of the outer and the inner, so the inner self and the outer environment, by making a fresh relationship between the self and the object. And the indeterminacy that was in state 2, the sense of excess, is taken as symbolizing the mind's relation to a transcendent order. So the sublime experience is a series of transitions, according to him. This had been linked to fear of industrialization in the East and gendered panic, but Outcut is asserting that it is a matter of race as well. So as the pastoral landscape that the white settlers identified with changed, so does the identification. Slavery made identification with the pastoral unstable, and that mirrors the eruption of the white sublime experience. So if the process of the sublimity creates a safe distance between the subject and the object, it can separate the white subject from having to deal with the social suffering of slavery when looking at the pastoral landscape. And so in Outcut's analysis, he looks at Crevecoeur's scene with the enslaved man and how it evokes antebellum America, and how it thrusts him out of the pastoral. He's forced to face this like brutal reality, but then Crevecoeur, his persona is focused on his own reactions and his own passivity, and he treats the man like an object of pity, and then says humanity herself would have recoiled. And he casts his experience as the white universal experience, so he casts himself as humanity. The enslaved man remains like a part of the landscape and apart from his or the white subjective experience. And then there's a comparison between the Crevecoeur and an earlier Emerson passage where he felt elevated by the transcendent natural. So it's paralleled in the way that both are elevated, both the enslaved man being physically elevated and Emerson being emotionally elevated, and it's parallel, but only one of them is against his will. So in the Emerson passage, he's cringing away from the narrative of nature that the slavery narrative evokes, to Outcut's analysis. In comparing the two figures, Outcut makes the assertion that Emerson is able to use transcendental subjectivity to escape the racialized history of the landscape, while the enslaved man remains literally and figuratively bound. So Emerson's Sublime is a process of white world making. In the third section, Territory and the Fugitive Slave Law, slavery was stated to be a metaphysical toxin in white transcendentalist nature writing, so it threatened to pollute the environment and the white identity. And then in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. It meant that enslaved people that escaped the South were still considered chattel, and they could be forced to return. The Northern outrage over this was over being deterritorialized more than it was about the racism of the action or any particular concern for enslaved people. I mean, on an individual basis, it did kind of have its... there were... white abolitionists, but overall there was a boundary between enslaved space and free space, and the Fugitive Slave Act threatened that, so it became about their identity as Northerners as opposed to Southerners. And so at the time, Emerson wrote about not being personally impacted by slavery until that point, so it was an example of the white distance that could be created by the subjectivity that was occasioned by the act of the natural sublime. He writes about a uniting of Virginia, Africa, and Massachusetts, and it blurs the lines between discourses of slavery, nature, and race. So Webster was a senator from Boston who supported the Fugitive Slave Act, and he was the focus of Emerson's writing at the time. Emerson was very critical of him. He'd been popular previously, and his support of the Fugitive Slave Act made it so that he appeared not to be able to extend his white sublimity to the Black community. So he was perceived as a failure, and it affected him greatly because Boston was very pro-abolition. So the Fugitive Slave Act threatened to pollute the entire American landscape. It undermines the transcendentalist dream of geography not marked by race. Thoreau, in his writing on slavery, he loses the ability to escape into nature, and as he's writing, the landscape of Massachusetts changes for him into a hellish landscape. Slavery rewrites the New England landscape and the New England subject. The transcendentalist merge of landscape and subject is still there, but instead the trauma moved from its safe location in enslaved Black bodies, and it infects the landscape, and it in turn infects Thoreau and Walden. And then the article overall ends on not wanting to necessarily blame Thoreau and Emerson for wanting to escape the racism of their environment, but and of their historical moment, and instead wanting to identify with a wild natural world, a world free of these demarcations. But it highlights the danger of doing so in that it aids political escapism. So the idea is the ideology of everyone being human and everybody being connected through nature, and this like demarcating of category, it creates this degraded territory outside of the universal that is other and that is able to be exploited, and it causes harm to those that can't separate themselves, who have to live in the outside world where the demarcations are still there. So white Americans can benefit from the divide and then absolve themselves of guilt through the act of sublime reflection.